All mobilization plans depended on the railways. At that time, the motor car, the automobile, was hardly used, certainly not as an instrument of mass communications. And as you are aware, railways demand timetables. You can't just go down to a railway station and say, start moving these chaps, as you can load them into a car or a truck or a coach and say, off with you. All the mobilization plans had been timed to the minute, months, years before. And what is more, they could not be changed. Moreover, if you tried to modify them in one direction, it would ruin them in every other direction. That any attempt, for instance, by the Austrians to mobilize against Serbia would mean that they couldn't mobilize as well against Russia, because the two lots of trains would be running against each other. The same problem was to arise in regard to Russia, and in the end, even in regard to Germany, that it was impossible, if you had a plan for mobilizing against France, to switch it round and mobilize against Russia. Any delay, any alteration in a mobilization plan meant not a change for 24 hours, but at least 6 months before the next lot of timetables were ready. The Austrians couldn't mobilize against Serbia because this would mean they were defenseless against Russia, so they didn't mobilize. Russia then thought she ought to stake out some claim to prove that she was going to support Serbia. So the Tsar and his advisors contemplated mobilization, but only against Austria. And this was actually ordered. Then the Russian generals who knew about the timetables pointed out that if they began to mobilize against Austria, Russia would then be totally defenseless against Germany, because you couldn't then do the mobilization against Germany as well or in supplement, because the train times would all be out of joint. So they scrapped the partial mobilization. And then the next day they said, but this is terrible, we have done nothing. Right, we'll have general mobilization. And the actual scene, we know, when they were still hesitating, and the Chief of the General Staff himself said that this was rather pushing things beyond what they wanted. They had no idea of a war against Russia. Even against Austria, this was a threat, not by any means a real preparation for, because they knew quite well that partial mobilization plans against Austria wouldn't work, were a mere gesture. And the Chief of the General Staff rashly said in the Tsar's presence, it is very hard to decide. And the Tsar, who was one of the most weak-willed men there had ever been, was touched by this and said, I will decide. General mobilization. He then, according to his diary, having made this, went out, found it a pleasant, warm evening. It doesn't mention the mobilization in his diary. It just says, pleasant, warm day, went for a bathe in the sea. Such was Russia's contribution. But now, with Russia having decided on mobilization and beginning mobilization, the problem moved to Germany. And here again, this is entirely a matter of railway timetables. It was said afterwards that mobilization meant war. Now, technically, for most countries, this wasn't true. It was a step towards war. Mobilization, after all, took place within your own country. The British fleet, the Royal Navy, had mobilized as late as 1911. Russia mobilized in 1913. There were occasions when other powers had mobilized, and because war didn't take place, the armies could be dispersed. With one country, however, this didn't apply. The German General Staff, ever since the creation of united Germany in 1871 under Bismarck, had contemplated the possibility of war on two fronts. France on the one side, Russia on the other. You must remember, I don't say this either in criticism or in defense of general staffs, you must remember it is the function of general staffs to plan for wars. It doesn't mean necessarily that they want these wars, it doesn't mean necessarily that they'll bring them about, but every general staff, at any rate, I don't know whether they do it now, but until recently, every general staff planned for wars. If you can't find a likely case for a war, then you plan for an unlikely case. But after all, there was a likely case. in regard to Germany. Germany did have two great neighbors, France on the one side, Russia on the other. Moreover, in 1894, France and Russia had made an alliance which was technically defensive in nature. Each would help the other if attacked. Actually, they were planning the other way around, but did face the problem that, for whatever reason, Germany might have a two-front war. The Chief of the General Staff, more than one of them, Moltke said it, the elder Moltke said it, Schlieffen said it, the younger Moltke said it, they all laid down, Germany cannot fight two great wars at the same time. As often happens with Chiefs of the General Staff, they were quite wrong. In 1914, Germany fought a two-front war and fought it successfully till 1918. Germany could have gone on defending herself indefinitely. This was a false alarm, but it was an alarm which absolutely dictated their policy. If you are faced with war on two fronts and you haven't got the resources to conduct both wars, what should you do? By definition, you can't eliminate one of the dangers by diplomacy, because if you did, there wouldn't be a two-front war. In fact, there wouldn't be a war at all. You're assuming diplomacy has failed. The German answer was to get in one blow first, and so decisively that they would have eliminated one enemy. At first they thought of doing it against Russia, then decided this was too difficult. Russia was too big. They go rambling into far remote places. The other, therefore, was to eliminate France. Ever since when they began planning this first, by 1875, ever since then, the idea had been you must beat France first. But France had a strongly fortified frontier. And after about 1890, the Germans decided they couldn't rush this frontier in the way that they'd rushed the French frontier in 1870. A way round must be found. This way must be through Belgium. They'd arrived at this conclusion as early as 1893, although it took a long time before the full plan was developed. Its most detailed form was arrived at in 1905. Characteristically, even now, the plan wasn't, people talk as though this plan devised by Schlieffen, the Schlieffen plan, was something absolutely dictated. Not at all. They were still playing around with it and still doubtful. But an essential part of this plan, one essential part, was to go through Germany. The other essential part, which was equally important, was that there could be no delay between mobilization and war. Because if there were delay, then Russia would catch up and the Germans would get the two-front war after all. So that the moment that the Germans decided on mobilization, they decided for war. Or rather, it wasn't they decided for war, the thing followed of itself. The railway timetables, which in other countries brought chaps to their mobilizing centers, to their barracks and so on, in the Schlieffen plan continued. They did not bring the troops to their barracks. They took them into Germany and northern France. The German mobilization plan actually laid down the first 40 days of the German invasion of France, and none of it could be altered, because if it did, all the timetables would go wrong. Thus the decision which the German General Staff made and which Bettmann endorsed on the 29th of July was a decision for a general European war.